Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 9, Section 2, Life During the Depression. Hopefully, it won't be too depressing for you, but we're going to talk a little bit about art. And yes, you're going to get a little fine art lesson here. I want to talk about this fella named Grant Woods. And you might notice the picture in the middle, something known as the American Gothic, which is kind of a well-known regional kind of style of art. I should mention Grant Woods, who is pictured over there on the left-hand side of your screen. Grant Woods was originally from my home state of Iowa. And he grew up in a fairly small town during the early part of the 20th century. I think he served in the military during World War I. After the war, he went to college, became a school teacher and an art teacher. And of all groups of people that he got to teach, he taught junior high kids. So, boy, Grant Woods, he was kind of asking for it. But in the summers, when he wasn't teaching junior high art, he would go to Europe and he would study the great masters. And he kind of developed his own little style of painting. And it's kind of known as regionalist as its theme. And a lot of his artwork really kind of has a Midwestern flavor. As a matter of fact, some of the work that he painted really didn't become popular until about the 1930s and 40s, during a time period where I think people kind of were looking back at the olden days with a little bit of nostalgia. I should mention with the American Gothic, the house that's kind of pictured in the background, that is a real house, and it still stands in Iowa yet in this day and age. The woman that is standing next to the older man is actually Grant Wood's sister. He asked her to pose for this, and the man who has the pitchfork, who looks like he is a farmer, is actually Grant Woods's dentist. So it's kind of interesting that you would have maybe a couple of people who are kind of look like the prototypical American farmers who actually probably weren't necessarily tied to the farm, so to speak. The picture kind of in the upper right-hand corner, this is actually of a schoolhouse that was kind of a rural schoolhouse. I love the road, which is kind of a dugout dirt road, which if you live in rural America, you're probably familiar with kind of those minimum maintenance roads. That's kind of what this one looks like. But it actually is on the backside of the Iowa Quarter. I believe that that's the image that they picked. The rolling hills of parts of northeastern Iowa are kind of pictured down below. I love the fact that they are, I think they're putting up hay in that picture down at the bottom, which kind of brings me some, maybe some memories from my childhood. Here's a picture of the little house. And yeah, there's his sister and his dentist, who I'm assuming probably look like that all the time just by his pose there. But he was also known for a couple of actual commission pieces. The Parsons Whims Fable, which if you take a look at the shorter figure in the picture, it's George Washington. And if you remember the story about, never telling a lie, he couldn't lie about cutting down the cherry tree. We believe that this was actually not actually a true story, but maybe one that maybe Parson Whims, who parson is basically kind of a term that people use for like a pastor. He's probably a Protestant minister of some type, using to help as an analogy, maybe to teach people. But he actually put pen to paper and kind of drew this out. The other is The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. And if you've ever read the Longfellow story, or it should say poem, where it's talking about, one if by land, two if by sea, this is kind of illustrating that. And it's kind of an interesting rendition of that. I kind of like that as well. But certainly he was kind of a folk artist. I think that's probably the best way to explain it. There's a little bit of the French impressionist that you might see here. Kind of looks very simplistic in its colors and maybe style, but at the same time, kind of showing some depth, and that makes it really kind of unique. And so that's kind of our regionalist perspective in art. So let's talk about life during the Depression. The Depression in 1932, it had worsened alone. There were some 30,000 companies that went out of business. And so if you were going to calculate the unemployment rate, about 1932, 1933, basically 1 out of 4 workers, so 25% of the workforce was unemployed. And you think about that maybe in terms of like the present day. Our state of Nebraska has less than 3% of the state population that is deemed unemployed. 25%, everybody would know somebody who lost a job. And that obviously probably compelled the fact that this was a really hard time, and thus terms like depression are kind of used to explain it. Jobless people often stood in bread lines. They also lined up outside of soup kitchens for free food. You didn't have government handouts. A lot of the food that was being handed out were from churches or other, groups that were trying to help those people who were in need. The term Hoover kind of got used to explain a lot of bad things. So if you look at the photograph kind of in the middle, you see Hoover's Poor Farm, and they've got a little can there for a tobacco farm or fund. Hard times are still hoovering over us. There was this kind of analogy that, if a person needed a blanket, you would have a Hoover blanket, which would have been like yesterday's newspaper that you could use to cover up to keep warm. Sometimes people reached into their pant pockets and pulled the pockets out so that you could see their Hoover flags to indicate that they didn't have any money. So yeah, things were rough by all means. Homeless people put up shacks on unused land or public land, forming communities known as shanty towns. And now, since we've been talking about Hoover, Hoovervilles. So if you take a look at the photograph on your left-hand side, you can kind of see that. Some homeless people and unemployed Americans wandered the country. Many of these people were called hobos because they would try to catch freight trains and just ride the rails. And it got to the point that many of the railroad companies like Union Pacific, the Santa Fe Railroad line, they would hire what they call bailers, which were basically bullies that would go around with like nightsticks. They weren't necessarily cops, but they were kind of like the private police force for the railroad, and they would beat the tar out of the people who were on these trains illegally to keep them from riding for free. Number 5, there was a terrible drought on the Great Plains that caused wheat fields in the U.S. from the Dakotas all the way down to Texas to dry up, and it became known as the Dust Bowl. If you look at the map on the right-hand side, you might notice that our state of Nebraska was kind of in a drought area, and then there was some places like in southeast Nebraska that were really drought-stricken. It was super rough. I've read accounts of farmers in Platte County that literally would look out the window, in the morning, and by afternoon, their green fields had turned to brown. That's how dry it was. And certainly that if that wasn't going to take care of your crops, there was issues with grasshoppers. And so whatever crops you had might get eaten by the grasshoppers. So it was a rough time. Many Great Plains farmers and their families, they packed up their belongings into old cars and trucks, and they headed west to California in search of a better life. And there was a nickname for those farmers, primarily that were from places like Oklahoma and Arkansas, and they were called Okies. And in many cases, Okies weren't treated much better than maybe Hispanics or blacks. And some businesses in California, they would put signs saying no Okies need apply, no Okies allowed, and maybe neighborhoods and parks and things like that. They really had a tough situation there trying to navigate. So, with the Dust Bowl, there were these events known as dust storms. And not that you hadn't seen a dust storm in your life, but the storms that we would see in the 1930s were epically big. And in many cases, they kind of traveled with like cold fronts, which, if you think about thunderstorms and how they develop, that's kind of how that works. In some cases, if you look at maybe the picture at the bottom right-hand corner, there was so much topsoil that was blowing that it literally looked like snow, that it was drifting in places. Homes that were not well insulated, dust would kind of like creep through the baseboards and window seals, and so your homes were like dusty. And so there was really no escape from that, especially if you were living in the areas that were deeply stricken. The photos that you see on the page below are really photos that are coming out of Nebraska. And so when you think about like, how bad it was maybe in Oklahoma and Texas, that was pretty awful. There were people here that probably experienced a lot of the same hardships. Okay, so it was a rough time. The photo that you see at the bottom here, this is actually one that I found in a historical book of a dust storm right outside of Humphrey. So even, your relatives, maybe your great or great grandparents probably could recall maybe living through something as awful as this. This is one that I think was taken out of Texas. And you can just see how massive it is. And I mentioned in class a while back that some of these storms, they were electrically charged. So you might hear thunder, you might see lightning, but there wasn't any precipitation that would fall from this. Sometimes you would have fierce wind that would follow behind this, but there was no relief. As far as rain that would fall. And unfortunately, if you got caught out in one of these, it was very dangerous. I mean, literally, you had to carry a handkerchief with you just to cover your face. A lot of people wore goggles to cover their eyes from the dust. And if you obviously had respiratory issues, this could be fatal in a sense. Our Okies. You might recognize the photo on the left-hand side. That is a photo called The Migrant Woman. And it was taken by a woman named Dorothea Lange. Matter of fact, the pictures that you see on your screen right now, all of them were taken by Dorothea Lange. But the pictures, with the exception of the one at the upper middle with the car, all of these are of the migrant woman's family. And the story goes as she was recently widowed. This woman is probably in her mid-30s. And here she has, 3 little babies. I always think about the child that she's holding in her hand and kind of that close-up of her holding her face and how the child in her arms looks. Moms are very conscientious about caring for their babies, and they want their babies to look clean and cared for. And this baby looks like it's, kind of dirty, and the rags that these people are wearing. I mean, they had really gone through a hard time, and the wrinkles on her face. Life was rough, and I don't know if we can really appreciate that. When you talk about those Okies heading west, the car that you see with all the stuff that's tied to the baseboards, I'm sure that, our local cop or our sheriff deputy would not want to see you tying stuff to your running boards or your pickup. But that's kind of what these folks were doing. They were taking everything that they could possibly haul with them, and they were, trying to, make a new life for themselves. So, entertainment and the arts in the 1930s. During the 30s, about 60 million people went to the movies each week because it was an escape and it was cheap. In many cases, movie theaters went out of their way to kind of encourage people to go there. You could go into a movie theater let's say on a Saturday afternoon, and for maybe a nickel to 10 cents, you could watch, cartoons, the newsreels, and then you could watch a feature movie, and you could stay after that movie finished. You could literally sit in that movie theater all day and all night. And people did that because that was their escape. Some movie theaters even gave away what they call depression glass. Like if you go to the movie theater, you could enter to a raffle and you could get a dish. And if you come back next week, you can get the next part of the set. And so that encouraged people to keep going to the films. During this decade, Walt Disney produced his first full-length animated feature known as Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. If you've ever gotten on Disney Plus and taken a look at that, it's a little slow and it's kind of long, but it was considered to be a huge technological breakthrough when it came out. The first African American to win an Academy Award was Hattie McDonald's for her role as kind of a maid in the movie called Gone with the Wind, and she got a lot of flack for that. There were some people that thought that she was feeding into the stereotype of how blacks were being treated in America, and she was kind of quoted for saying, she could be a maid in real life and earn $7 a week, or she could be an actress in Hollywood playing a maid and earn $700 a week. So I guess you kind of know the answer to her situation. And number 10, radio programs gave listeners information and entertainment. Millions of people were listening to comedians such as Jack Benny, who's pictured there kind of in the yellow background, George Burns and his wife Gracie Allen, who you see kind of hugging each other. I guess you could say Gracie Allen's was your prototypical dumb blonde, and George Burns was kind of your, I would say, straight man. He was kind of the foil of a lot of their comedy. You also had some of the first daytime dramas called soap operas because they were sponsored by makers of laundry detergent. Even today, soap operas are very popular, but people got kind of wrapped up into that. During the Depression, artists and writers portrayed the world around them. You had people who were like John Steinbeck, who wrote about, sympathy for characters and the indignation of social justice in his book called The Grapes of Wrath, which is about our Okies who were moving to California to escape the Great Depression or the Dust Bowl. You also had new writing techniques such as the stream of consciousness, which kind of pulls off of psychology. If you know anything about psychology, there was kind of a theorist who talked about the fact that, at any given moment, our mind can only hold so much information, and there's only so much that we're aware of. And for a lot of these writers, they would just kind of like, I guess you could call it a brain dump, where they would just kind of write about everything that they were experiencing at a given moment. It's a little much for some people to read, but it became kind of a style of the 20th century. In 1936, you had Henry Luntz, who introduced Life magazine, which was kind of like the Facebook of the 1930s and 40s. A lot of photos. It was a weekly photojournalism magazine. A lot of people loved it. Matter of fact, there were stories about families fighting over it when it would come to their homes. Margaret Brook White became one of their well-known photojournalists. Matter of fact, when we watched the movie Gandhi, she's actually a character who is photographing Gandhi when he's in his older age, imprisoned in India during the Second World War. But she captured in pictures how the Great Depression affected a lot of Americans, and thus she is kind of well known for that. Thank you very much.